All right, there we go. All right, I think we're good. So we'll open with prayer. Father, we come before you today. We thank you for your rain that brings nourishment. We thank you for the rain that was needed for our land and our area and our region. We thank you for the people who have come here tonight. And we thank you for the blessing of a meeting place that you've given us to come and learn about your word and your character more. May the things we learn tonight be a blessing to us, help us and encourage us to teach your word and share your word more with others. We love you, we bless you, and we give you thanks. Amen. All right, so we're going to wrap up Jonah, and it's only 7 verses, but they're a pretty power-packed 7 verses, so let's get started. We're at the second half of Jonah chapter 4, so just a short recap. Jonah's sitting on a hill. God has promised to show mercy to Nineveh, and Jonah went to a hill outside the city, and he pitched a tent or a booth. He erected a booth, a shelter over himself, and he's basically sitting there pouting. And so that's really where we've left off here. So we kind of talked about last time why he's sitting on this hill and the time frame. You know, they were given 40 days and of judgment, 40 days until impending judgment. And Jonah goes and pitches a tent or sets a booth up on a hill very shortly afterwards because they reacted very quickly. It's almost as if Jonah's sitting on the hill waiting for Nineveh to be destroyed at the end of the 40 days. So that's where we're at. We'll kind of read the rest of the chapter real quick, verses 6 through 11, and then we'll go into them like we have been. So chapter 6, then the Lord appointed a plant, and it grew over Jonah to provide shade for his head to rescue him from his trouble. Jonah was greatly pleased with the plant. When dawn came the next day, God appointed a worm that attacked the plant, and it withered. As the sun was rising, God appointed a scorching east wind. The sun beat down on Jonah's head so much that he almost fainted, and he wanted to die. He said, "It's better for me to die than to live." Then God asked Jonah, "Is it right for you to be angry about the plant?" "Yes, it's right," he replied. "I'm angry enough to die." And the Lord said, "You care about a plant which you did not labor over and did not grow. It appeared in a night and perished in a night. So may I not care about the great city of Nineveh, which has more than 120,000 people who cannot distinguish between their right and their left, as well as many animals?" And that's where it leaves off at the end. So let's go back to verse 6, and we're going to get through these last verses here. Verse 6 says, "The Lord God appointed a plant, and it grew over Jonah to provide shade for his head to rescue him from his trouble. Jonah was greatly pleased with the plant." So any first thoughts on this verse? Any thoughts on what's going on here with Jonah and this plant? So Jonah's sitting outside here. He's waiting for, this is just a picture I get, he's waiting for Yahweh to intervene and to destroy Nineveh. But what does God do instead? He intervenes and does what? Nothing for Nineveh. He comforts Jonah. So Jonah's sitting back waiting for Nineveh to be destroyed, but instead of Yahweh destroying Nineveh, he actually gives mercy to Jonah. So Jonah asks God for mercy about what? What's just like in the, I think, last verse, he asked for mercy. What do you ask for mercy for? Or I guess in this verse, I'm sorry. What's he asking for mercy for? Well, basically, he doesn't ask for mercy like very directly. He's basically saying the same thing he said before. He's asking to die, which is, he's asked to die, I think, back in verse 3. So why did he ask to die in verse 3, I think it was? Is that right? Yeah, "And now, Lord, take my life from me, for it's better for me to die than to live." Do we remember what that was for? He wanted to die. Okay.
The 40 days hasn't happened. He's sitting there waiting to see what's going to happen, and yet he's already
Distraught.
in his mind decided what's going to happen, and so he just wants to die.
He just wants to die. So I think he is sitting there. I think his expectation or waiting for what he wants to happen, which is the destruction of Nineveh, is really wishful thinking. It's God himself who tells him he's going to give him, that he's going to give mercy to Nineveh, right? Let me see, I was going back up here to verse, to my other notes. Chapter 3, the last verse. Flip to that real quick. There we go. Yeah, so Jonah chapter 3, the last verse, God saw their actions, that they had done their evil ways, so God relented from the disaster. So the 40 days isn't necessarily up yet, but God has given some indication that he's relented from what he intended to do, what the judgment is. And so that's what Nineveh's struggle here, Jonah's struggle here is not from any real physical pain. What he wants mercy from is basically his theological issues. Like he's struggling internally to the point of death. And so he sits there and says, well, maybe God will see, this is my amplified, Matt's amplified version here. Maybe God will see the anguish that his own single person is in and relent from his relenting against the 120,000 people. That's really what the picture I get from this reading. And so instead, Yahweh decides to intervene in the life of Jonah. Jonah asks Yahweh for mercy on behalf of his theological problems. And the issue with that's the same as before. He had a theological issue in the beginning. He doesn't want to do what God's called him to do. Will you please just kill me? Will you allow me to die in the ocean? And so here, Yahweh shows mercy towards his physical problem instead of his impending problem that's inside that really is causing the most turmoil. So there's some irony here. What's the irony that we see in this? Any clues, any indication? Irony, remember, is like what should happen, what we expect to happen, something else happens, that type of thing.
That Jonah gets the mercy that he doesn't want for Nineveh.
That's good. Jonah gets the mercy that he doesn't want for Nineveh. How about also that Jonah, what's Jonah's reaction to the tree? He's glad. He rejoices. It says he's pleased. But what should Jonah really be pleased with? Yahweh, or Yahweh's mercy against a whole great city of people, right? So instead of rejoicing in the mercy of Yahweh, he decides to rejoice in a single plant and his individual discomfort. So there's a word here, manah, which means, anybody know what manah means? To appoint. To appoint. Is it kind of strange that he appoints a plant? It's kind of strange. He appoints a plant. Do you have a different translation, anybody?
No.
Everybody says appoint. What's that?
Gourd.
A gourd? Oh, no, like the verb, appoint.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Does yours say appoint?
No.
What verse you talking about?
Verse 6, where we're at. It says Yahweh appoints a plant.
It rained.
There.
He prepared a plant, or he arranged a plant. Yeah, so appointed is actually the verb there. It's a verb that's usually used for like whenever God's going to install a king, or when Israel installs a king over them, they appoint the king. But here, and especially in this chapter, if you haven't guessed yet, we've talked about so many words that repeat themselves. This word repeats itself as well. Do we remember where this verse was, or this word appoint may have been before? I know we had a week in between here. But back in chapter 1, the last verse, God appoints a fish. He appoints a fish to swallow Jonah. So you kind of have the same word here, and as we move forward in the next two verses, or the next two verses, he's going to appoint the plant, and he's going to appoint a worm, and he's going to appoint a wind and scorching sun. So we really see this word appointing just connecting the story. It's a short story, but we still have these like tentacles of connections across the story. Unlike many other stories, there's so many connections here. But this plant of mercy corresponds to the fish of mercy. And so this mercy that they both have here, this manna, this appointing from God, what was the use for both of those? What was the end use for both of those? All right, well, let's talk about what was the use of the plant. What was the point of the plant? To give him shade. Ah, what lesson? To teach him a lesson. That Nineveh is just as precious as the plant. You're jumping ahead a little bit, I think. But that is part of a lesson. But I think the plant was to provide shade, but was it to permanently provide shade? We find out, no, that's not the answer, right? Same thing with a fish. Same thing with the scorching wind. Same thing with the scorching sun, that these things aren't permanent, but they're just tools of God appointed to bring Jonah to a specific place where God can address that inner turmoil that he's struggling with. So the other thing here is that this plan of mercy corresponds, I think Pat said it, to Nineveh, or maybe you, that it corresponds to Nineveh here in such a way, this plant and this, I would say the plan of mercy and the mercy of God first, before we get to what we were talking about with the plant and how Jonah views the plant versus God viewing the city. But this plant gives mercy to Jonah, and God gives mercy to the city. And I think I've lost track here, who said what, but someone said something about what Jonah doesn't deserve, right? And so in both of these situations, you have undeserved mercy. Like the people of Nineveh, really, they did the bare minimum. They've lived lives of wickedness. There's no real true following Yahweh. They never call out to Yahweh. They never worship Yahweh. They simply respond to his oracle of destruction just to save their own hide. And here, Jonah doesn't deserve up to this point anything, right? He's been selfish. He's been self-serving. He's not wanted to do the will of God. And so both of these things are undeserved mercy. And if we compare the mercy of the plant towards Jonah and God's mercy towards Nineveh, we also then have to compare what else? Jonah to who? To us? I would say in the story, Jonah to Nineveh. Both of them are the very thing that he wants to separate himself from. In this story, it's showing him more and more becoming the people that he disdains, right? The people that he doesn't want to receive God's mercy. Because they're both recipients of grace here. They both are getting something they don't deserve. So there's a part in here in verse 6. It says, then the Lord God, or Yahweh Elohim. Have we seen that connection before? Have we seen that use before? I know we've spent weeks in this book, but I'll give you the answer, no, we haven't seen that. So up until this point, it's either been Elohim or Yahweh, but here it's Yahweh Elohim. Do you think that's deliberate or just so happens? I pointed it, yeah, putting emphasis there. I do think it's deliberate. The question is, why is it deliberate, right? Why is it this is the only place in the entire book where Yahweh Elohim, which is used quite a bit in some other books, but why is it at this moment that Yahweh Elohim is used? This is just what I came up with. Up until this point, Yahweh as the divine name is used in reference to Jonah. So when Jonah is interacting with Yahweh, he never has spoken to Yahweh to this point. But when he's interacting, whenever Yahweh is doing things with Jonah, telling him things, it always refers to him as Yahweh. How does it refer to God when he's dealing with the Ninevites or the sailors? Elohim. Elohim. So here, I was wrestling with this just today. I'm like, what is the point of this? Well, as we look forward in the next few verses, Jonah is going to be interacting with God. And in those verses, unlike the rest of the book, it's going to refer to God as Elohim instead of Yahweh. So what are we seeing there in that? What can we deduce from that? So let me kind of package it up real quick for a discussion. For the whole rest of the book, Jonah's interaction with God is called Yahweh. But the Ninevites and the sailors, those who aren't God's people, their interaction with God, he's referred to as Elohim. Here, he's referred to as Yahweh Elohim, and for the next few verses, he's only referred to as Elohim with Jonah, which was previously for the other people. So what does that mean What's the emphasis here? Why is the author doing this? Any ideas? Lost favor with God? He said he's lost favor with God. Any other thoughts?
It's in stages, so I thought maybe it was evolvement.
In stages or an involvement? I think there is an involvement that happens here. Me personally, this is what I walked away with, similar to what you're saying there, is that Jonah's supposed to be the one who knows the character of God and knows how to interact with God, knows how to respond to God, knows exactly what God wants in response to his actions within creation. The other people don't. And so here, his reference to Yahweh Elohim that goes forward in him only being referred to as Elohim in his relationship with Jonah, to me, would show a shift in Jonah, the prophet from the beginning, the prophet who should always have known Yahweh, who's continuously run from him, not wanting to serve him. The other people serve him better than he does. And now it's like, you're the one who's supposed to know my covenants, my character, my actions, but you're acting like the rest of the world who doesn't know me. And that's really what I think moving forward as we get to the last verse. Because Jonah has said what he was angry about. Jonah's angry at the fact that he knows Yahweh, or he thinks he knows Yahweh, and he knows what Yahweh will do. He'll be merciful to a bunch of people who refuse to follow him. But we'll see what happens in the end. And I think from this point to the end of the book, the reason he's referred to as Elohim is because Jonah, who should have known who Yahweh was and his character, really didn't know it at all. Any other observations in this verse? What kind of plant do you think this is? This is just like I went down a trail this week looking at this plant. I mean, does it say what kind of plant it is? Just this plant, yeah. It's just plant, but there's an interesting play on words like the rest of the book where, remember the connection? We were talking about the connection between the fish and the plant and the fact that both of them were appointed by God. And what does the fish do to Jonah? Vomits him out. The word is kiyah, to vomit. He vomited him out. What's the word for plant? Kikion, which is very similar, right? There's like a poetic wordplay going on. What's a plant? This is kind of an unfair question. I looked it up, so I wouldn't have been able to answer this question. But what's the kind of plant that would make you vomit? Lots of them, yeah. Specifically that region, a castor oil plant. A castor oil plant is notably known for growing extremely fast with big, huge leaves. And so some have suggested this was a castor oil plant. And the connection there, that it was very prolific, it was a very well-established plant in the region, and that connection linguistic there. So one last question I had for this. I mean, what's the end of this verse? What's Jonah's disposition? He's glad with what? What about his anger with Yahweh? Oh, that's really good. I mean, to me, I read it. When I go through and I read this again, I'm reading it, and I'm like, here's angry Jonah. Oh, here's happy Jonah. We can lose sight of the fact that Jonah's still angry with Yahweh. He's just happy with the plant. So what does that say? I mean, I think the caricature of Jonah is being played out pretty good here at the end, right? Remember, this is satire. This is meant to be like an over-the-top depiction of Jonah, over-the-top depiction of God, and all of that's kind of starting to formulate really big here at the end. Jonah is angry that God is who he is, but here he's happy with the little plant. What about his booth? You brought that up last time we were here. The sukkah. What about his sukkah? Where's it at? I mean, he built it last verse, but now he's happy about a plant. Why is he happy about a plant if he has a sukkah? Yeah, I mean, I don't know. We'll go forward and see. Verse 7, when dawn came the next day, God appointed a worm and attacked the plant, and it withered. All right, so what are some thoughts here?
Well, it withered away. I mean, I don't think it just collapsed, but it was maybe slowly, and he's watching me, I don't know, as the sun starts to beat down
well, is the sun beat? Here's a good question. Is the sun beating down on him at all? It's not if he's got a sukkah. So, it's interesting. Why does he need the plant? Why is he so pleased with this little plant? And why is he so displeased that the plant goes away? It's kind of like I had a question this week from someone here at service that asked about the creation story, and I think just about everybody in here has had this discussion before. What light is there at day 1 when God creates the sun, moon, and stars on day 4? All right. How do we have this light there before God creates light? I mean, he creates light. He says there's light, but not the lights that we know. Something similar here. Why is Jonah upset about a shade plant when God doesn't appoint the scorching wind and the sun until the next verse? What's going on there? I don't necessarily know.
I kind of wonder how that, I just looked at every, like, maybe God showed him, like a replica of Nineveh, like, give something and have life, and it takes it away, kind of showing him, like, if I took this with them, how they, I don't know.
No, I think you're on something there. I think you're on to an ending of the book that I think most of us might be surprised with, but that just like if God can show them mercy doesn't mean that he'll be merciful forever. Is that what you're saying? That he can give them mercy now, but he can take it away if he wants to?
Well, it's like Jonah, like Jonah's want this, but then like in this little couple verses, he's like showing Jonah what will play out in Nineveh, or how it'd be like, how he can connect and understand
Okay.
compassion and mercy.
Yeah, so he's trying to get Jonah to connect what? The plant to Nineveh? Is that where you're going?
Yeah, kind of.
I think that's good. And so it happens quickly, right? That's one aspect of this verse, that God gives them a plant, and then the very next day the plant is destroyed. So as quickly as God can raise up a plant to give him shade, he can actually allow that plant to be destroyed the very next day. And so you're highlighting something that I think is very good about God's character, but also about the storyline itself. If God can do this with a plant, God could also do this with Nineveh. I think you're connecting the plant to Nineveh, which is something most people don't do in this chapter. I think it's really good. What else? Go ahead.
Got the same word here, as for the fish and the plant that he prepared a worm.
Yep.
There's maybe a point.
Appointed a worm. Yeah, same Hebrew word. Yep.
Same.
So he appointed the worm.
Fish, the
He
plant,
appointed the
worm.
fish. He appointed the plant. God has. What are we getting from this? That word's a stronger word to me than prepared, or what some other translations we had, or even in this verse 7. What does he do to the worm for some of y'all? Points it. Prepared. Anybody else have anything? What's that? Appointed. I thought you had something different.
Prepared.
Oh, yours is prepared too? Yeah. So prepared to me is a little softer. It's like, oh, let me go over here and fix this worm up. But appoint, that's a strong word. Again, that's a word that's used for when God appoints a king over a nation. So I think this, for me, this use of this word, appoint, highlights God's intentionality, that he is directly affecting what's going on in this scenario, all these scenarios. God directly affected the fish to go and do what he did. God's in control. This isn't like happenstance, which I think if I remember like kid reading of the story of Jonah, it's almost like Jonah falls in and like, oh, look, a fish swallowed him. No, like God appointed a fish to swallow him. It's very direct and intentional. What else? What's the worm do to the plant in your English translations? Attacked, crippled, smote. Oh, I like that one. What translation is that? King James. He smote it. That's really good because, like, okay, so think about the absurdity here. What does a worm usually do to a plant? How quickly? Very slowly. I mean, like, it doesn't attack it, right? A worm is like a caterpillar. It crawls. Oh, a tomato worm. Yeah, it'll eat it pretty fast, yeah. I'm thinking of like a caterpillar, like they're not attacking for one. They're like crawling along and, oh, a plant, let me go eat it. You almost get this bumbly, ho-hum attitude from a caterpillar. Let me go see what I can find to eat today. Oh, here's a plant. No, God appoints a worm to attack the plant. And not just, I like smoke because the word there really means something like struck. he appoints the worm that struck the plant. I mean, again, something that worms don't do. You kind of get this warfare mentality, and I think we should, right? Caterpillars don't attack. Caterpillars don't smite. Caterpillars don't go to war against plants. They lazily and haphazardly munch on the plant that just happens to be there. And I think we're going to start seeing something formulate here that you were hinting on there with connecting Nineveh to the plant. So when we think of strike, what do we think of, like, with God? If God strikes something or he appoints something to be smitten. Lightning bolts. Yeah. It's judgment. It's judgment, right? This is so the question is this a judgment on Jonah or is it a judgment on the plant?
Well, I think the plant was in the way.
The plant was in the way. That's a good one. The plant was in the way. It's a good question. We'll think about it here for just a second. And you said withered. So when we think about withered, again, we see somewhat of a less active verb, and it is withered here. That's the most thing here. But here's the word. The Hebrew word for withered is yavesh. And if I say yavesh is withered and yaveshah means something else, can we kind of see the same type of play on words that happens poetically throughout this whole book? You know what yaveshah is? Dry land. Where have we seen that before? When the appointed fish vomited the Jonah out onto the dry land. This is really just like a repeat. God's like doing again what he's done before. And so what can we kind of understand from that? Just comically. If a big fish can't get your attention to where you'll stop and talk to me, maybe this tiny little plant will. I mean, this is like intended to be somewhat humorous. The same words are being used, are poetically connected between the fish that was appointed, that vomited him out, that ended up on dry land, and here this plant is appointed. Plant is, phonetically connected to vomit, and this withering and dry land are connected together there phonetically as well. So both situations, it is forcing Jonah to try to interact with God, because here's what we haven't talked about. Like, what interaction has Jonah had with God to this point? What interaction, direct interaction, has Jonah had with God? We've had some interaction with God to Jonah. God tells him to get up and go a few times. God causes things to happen. He appoints a fish, appoints a plant. God speaks to Jonah, multiple situations. What does God do? What does Jonah do towards God? He's done absolutely nothing to this point. Even chapter 2, the poetic verse that we have is, the language there is not directed at God, but about God. More specifically about himself and what God owes him. And so he never has, would you say? He ignores him. He ignores God. He thinks that he is better and shouldn't be treated this way. And so here, if a fish won't get your attention and get you to have a conversation with me, maybe this little plant will. What else? Anything else in this verse? We said it a while ago, but neither the fish nor the plant were meant to be permanent places of comfort for Jonah. They were actually intended. So the purpose of the plant, we say, oh, well, it gave him shade, and the purpose was the shade. Now, the purpose was what came the very next morning. The purpose was to bring him more discomfort. All right, we'll move to verse 8. As the sun was rising, God appointed a scorching east wind. The sun beat down on Jonah's head as much as that he almost fainted, and he wanted to die. And he said, it's better for me to die than to live. So here we have Jonah sitting next to this withered plant that Yahweh caused to rise up and fall down. And the plant falls down, and he just wants to die. So where's the booth? Where's the booth? Who built the booth? Jonah built the booth, right? I think that's the point for me. I'm not sure what I want to do with this booth. I'm not sure what to think about it, but yeah, well, so I have a note in here that if it wasn't already gone before this verse, it's gone after this verse. I think when we think about a wind blowing a booth, we think about like today, if I go build a sukkah, that joker's sturdy. I'm going to have it roped off, screws in it. If I'm building it with 2x4s or whatever, it's going to be hard. It's going to be a big wind to make that thing blow over. But really back then, you're talking about, I'm thinking when I was a kid, I was talking the other day with Melissa about how when I was a kid, man, my parents, like, literally the adage of like, I left when the sun came up, and as long as I was back by the sun went down, my parents didn't care. They did not care. And we were talking about neighborhoods, and Derek Salter lived 4 neighborhoods away, and I would just ride my bike through the woods, and I'd be way over here, several miles away from home, and my parents never knew, never asked. And we used to go in the woods, and we'd have all these trails and forts, and so like I was thinking about what is a true sukkah back then would be similar to like the forts we used to build. We'd cut the pine branches and just make lean-tos and stuff. That's really what a sukkah, a booth, was back then. It's really leaves and branches, and it's not very sturdy. So I don't know whether the booth was gone before now. It's definitely gone after this wind comes. So here we have Yahweh. What does he do with this scorching wind? Elohim. Remember, it's not Yahweh anymore. He appoints it. Here we go again. The plant doesn't cause Jonah to say anything to God, but here he sends a scorching east wind. So this is, I'm going to teach you a phrase here, or some of you may know it, I don't know. Anybody ever seen the Latin phrase called hapax legomena? Hapax legomenon. Long word, I don't know why they can't just make it like something else, but it's a Latin word that basically means this phrase is found only here and nowhere else in the Bible. So a hapax legomenon is a phrase or a word that's only found one time in Scripture. So the scorching wind, the word scorching there is what's questionable. And it's just neat. I don't think it affects the verse, but there's another possibility that instead of a scorching wind, it could be a silent wind. So how would that affect how we read the verse? Yeah, God appointed a silent east wind. The sun beat down on Jonah's head. Heat would come, or I think for me, I would still stick with the scorching east wind. I don't see enough to try to change it, but even a silent east wind would be almost like playing into Jonah's inability to see what God would do. It's like he should expect that God's going to do something else, and he doesn't. He can't feel it, can't see it, can't hear it. What about east wind? We ever heard that before? East wind, where have we heard that before? Oh, he had to exit. Yeah, he exited the city to the east. That's right. Yeah, he's in between the wind and the city. No protection at all. I think that's important.
Wasn't it the east wind that blew the Red Sea crossing?
East wind blew the Red Sea.
East wind brought the quail.
East wind brought, I don't know if that brought was it east wind or a great wind? I can't remember. I have to look that one up. I had the locust from the 10 plagues. The locust came from an east wind. In Psalm 48:7, God destroys some ships with an east wind. Jeremiah 18:17, God says that he scatters all of his people, talking about the judgment and the exile of people. He scatters them with an east wind. Hosea basically says there's coming judgment in the form of an east wind. So what do we get from this, like east wind? What does that mean? Must be something serious, but it's judgment. Wrath and judgment. Opposed for, the only interesting one is the Red Sea, the first one you thought of, that was deliverance for Israelites, but judgment for the Egyptians. The same wind that delivered the Israelites was the wind that destroyed the Egyptians. And I think maybe, I didn't go down that rabbit trail enough today, but I think maybe we can see some stuff going on there. There's an interesting connection, and we didn't go through it last chapter, and really we don't have time to go through it. I'll just give you homework and say, go read 1 Kings 19 and look and just compare Jonah to Elijah. And we briefly mentioned it, but there's a lot to be said there. But one of the connections between the two chapters is a wind, that both are sitting there solemnly and individually waiting on Yahweh to act, and both of them are interacted through a wind. It's a strong wind for Elijah, an east wind for Jonah, which I think there's something to be said there. But the most connection is that they both have this expression that I would rather die. Please take my life, you know. And so I will just give you that homework, or I don't want to keep us too long tonight, but that would be something to go and try to connect. And really, I think the intended comparison by the author of Jonah, I think Jonah knew 1 Kings 19, or the author of Jonah knew 1 Kings 19, and they intentionally tie those two stories together to compare the good prophet Elijah, who seeks to obey God to the point that he thinks he's failing and wants to die because he's failing, and Jonah the prophet, who does everything he can not to obey God and wants to die so that he doesn't have to fulfill what God's wanting him to do. So that's it in a nutshell, but it's neat to see the different interactions there. How many times has Jonah wanted to die so far? A bunch. 3 times so far. Chapter 1, he wants to die like on the boat. Verse 3, in this chapter alone, he wants to die twice. So verse 3, he wants to die from the anger that he has towards God. And here he wants to die from his immense turmoil. And I think that if I'm reading into Jonah what I think I'm reading, it's not this physical pain, but this internal turmoil, this agony over his theological and emotional issues with God. Here, this agony over the loss of a plant. I mean, is it really the loss of a plant? It highlights all of his desires to die before this time, that they're all self-pity. None of them are like Elijah, who wants to die so that God can send another prophet to do better than him. Here, he wants to die so that he can, have some. He's wallowing in his self-pity. What's one thing that Jonah could do in this moment? If he's writhing in agony from all of this east wind, the scorching heat, the plants died, his sukkah's probably who knows where. Like, what could he do in this moment if he really wanted to have shelter from all of this? What's that? Repent? Well, okay, let's play on that a little bit. What's repent mean? To turn. It just means to turn, not necessarily towards God or away from God, but just to turn. So I do think it means he could just repent. Where'd he come from? I mean, there's a whole city right down the hill that has all of this cover from this wind and this scorching heat and all of this, but I think he refuses to go, right? I think that's the character of Jonah. Yeah. Oh, that's a better point. That's not what I was thinking. I was thinking if he was writhing in agony from all this heat and wind, he could simply walk down the hill to the city and go get protection. But really, if he wants to die and he thinks that God is going to eventually judge him in 40 days, why don't he just go to the city anyway? That's a good point. Or why did he just not do what he thought in the beginning to tell him the message of God and cause him to respond? That's a good point. He could just walk down the city if he thinks they're still going to be judged. Anything else in verse 8? Does he know what's going on in the city? Oh, well, yeah, so he leaves the city after they've started to respond, and God says, I'm going to relent. He uses this word, relent. So God says, I see what they're doing, and I'm going to relent. I'm not going to judge them like I said I was going to, but it seems that only Jonah really knows this aspect, and so he leaves the city, and he's pouting on this hill thinking, well, okay, yeah, you'll relent for the next 37 days, but judgment surely is going to come, right? So verse 9, I did not copy over verse 9 out of all of my verses here. Verse 9 says, Then God asked Jonah, Is it right for you to be angry about the plan? Does this sound familiar at all? Yeah, earlier in the same chapter, he says, Is it right for you to be angry? So the first time, what's he asking about? What was he angry about? God's mercy. Here, what's he mad about? God's wrath against the plan. He gets mad at God's mercy towards Nineveh, but now he's mad at God's wrath towards a plan. What's Jonah's response to the question the first time? Nothing. He doesn't respond. Again, to this point, he's not responded to God by speaking to him whatsoever. The one thing that I think is overwhelming throughout this book is like God is a God of relationships. God is a God of interacting with people. He hears, he's willing to hear, but he refuses to do. But Jonah refuses to speak. So, what does he do here, though? He actually speaks back. He actually speaks back. So the plant did its job, right? Because the plant's purpose was not to give him shade. The plant's purpose was to force and push Jonah into speaking to God for the first time. And here's the irony. Like, he's the mouthpiece of God. He's the one that God's supposed to speak through, but he can't speak to him. It's pretty interesting. So Jonah says what? What does Jonah say in response? He says, I'm well within my right to be mad about this. He said, yes, it's right, he replied. I'm angry enough to die. Okay. He says he wants to die again. That's how many times? 4 times. So Jonah says that he's well within his rights to be mad to death about the plant dying. But what does this really do? What just happened here in the story? We've got 4 chapters. We're at the last chapter. We only have a few more verses. And finally, Jonah has spoken. Anybody ever been like mad at their spouse or loved one, or even mad at a kid or your parents? Like, you don't talk to them. You won't say nothing. You walk around just miserable. I ain't talking to him. I ain't talking to her. And what happens that moment that you finally like, all right, let's talk? It opens, oh, well, that's not what should happen. Not snap. Usually, it opens up more discourse, and you're talking about things that matter more than what your anger was, right? That's really kind of what happens here, is God uses this plant to open him up to talk about the deeper issues. Jonah, are you mad about a plant? Do you think it's right you're mad about this plant? Jonah says, absolutely I'm mad about this plant. Is that really what God wants to talk to Jonah about, being mad about a plant? No, not at all. I thought of this other section, 2 Samuel 12, where the prophet Nathan comes to David. What does he do? He talks to him about a parable of the poor man's sheep. And he gets David to open up about this poor man's sheep, and then what's he do at the end? David, you're the man. You're the man. And so something similar here is going on. He gets Jonah to just speak for the first time about a small little measly plant, but it really opens Jonah up to talk about some deeper issues. So that was a short verse. Any other comments on verse 9? Verse 10, and the Lord said, that's Adonai, you cared about the plant which you did not labor over and did not grow. It appeared in a night and it perished in a night. So what has God done to Jonah this whole book? What has he done?
Why did you go back to being Adonai there?
Well, no, not Yahweh. Not Yahweh. Yahweh is what he usually is with Jonah. But what does he do this whole book? He pursues Jonah. Like he's like going after Jonah. He follows Jonah. He tells Jonah to go in one way. And here's like part of God's character. Like, what would I do if I just said, like, I'm thinking like my military career, I'd tell a bunch of privates to go do something, they go the opposite direction. I'm going to sit back and be like, oh, they'll be back in a minute. That's not what God does. Like, God went after him. He followed him into the western sea, and then he follows him. Think about this, too. Jonah went west to escape God. God brings him back, spits him up on the land. Now he goes east to Nineveh, don't like what happens, and then he goes east the other way. It's almost like he's going as far as he can both directions, but God follows him in both places. So he uses all of these things. He's chasing him down to do what? To expose Jonah's issue. So what's the question that what's the question that he's asking here in verse 10? You cared about a plant which you did not grow. You did not labor over it. It appeared, basically, it's a question that's not a question, really. What is it? Why do you care? Why do you have compassion over a plant? You're not worried about these people down here. and you had nothing to do with it at all. I mean, first of all, I'm thinking of so many times where I've been in that situation where it's like I had something that I didn't work for, and then it left, and it's like, why am I mad that I didn't even work for it? But does Jonah have compassion on this plant? What's your saying there? Mine says you cared about the plant. What's some other ones? You felt sorry for the plant? Pity?
I think
Felt
it's
pity?
usually for a reason to have a pity party to tell the man.
Oh, there's a good, Tommy said he uses it to have his own pity party. So what kind of care is that? Is he concerned about the plant? Concerned about himself? So there's this word, havis, is compassion or pity. Almost every time in the Bible it's used compassion or pity. But there's a couple of places. Genesis 45:20 is one where it's the people are told, don't be concerned about your belongings. There's enough stuff in Egypt. It's Jacob and the family going to Egypt. And are they really saying have compassion on your stuff? They're really more concerned about leaving their stuff, right? It's more of a concern of themselves. So we kind of have this thing where it's like there's a few instances where this compassion and pity or to care for is actually being touched or moved by in a way that really you're worried about yourself. And so just like the Joseph's family in Genesis 45, they were concerned not with they're not having compassion on their luggage or compassion on their belongings. They're having compassion for themselves at the idea of losing those belongings. And so that's kind of what's happening here, and it's kind of important moving forward. Any other thoughts there on verse 10? It's always an interesting verse to me. I mean, how much, what do we have that we've done ourselves? Like, do we have things in our life that we've done ourselves? I think there's a verse in the New Testament that says, don't think that anything you've ever gotten or had in life is of your own hand, but it's all a gift from God. So it's like anything that we lose out on, this is like a lesson for me. Did I really work for it? Could I work hard enough to have the blessings that I have? Could I work hard enough to have 5 beautiful children? I mean, those are like, I was sitting back thinking about that today, like I'm blessed with 5 beautiful children. Is there any amount of like good works that I could do to deserve that? Probably not. I don't think so. And so really we should see ourselves in Jonah here. But moving to verse 11, and this is really the culmination of the entire book. So may I not care about the great city Nineveh, which has more than 120,000 people who cannot distinguish their right from their left, as well as many animals. It's a big question, right? So the plant is no longer a plant. You know what I mean by that? Verse 10 and verse 11. Verse 10, we're talking about a plant, and Yahweh switches over, and now he's talking about Nineveh. The plant is Nineveh. So the plant is no longer a plant. The plant correlates to Nineveh here. This great Ha'ir, Hagedollah, Nineveh, the great city of Nineveh. It's not just about a city. There's 120,000 people there. Like up until this point, we've seen people interacting within the city. We've seen people speaking in the city, like the mayor, the king. But here we see that the entire city has 120,000 faces, and not just faces of people, but faces of animals. So what does that tell us? Or what's like, I'm not trying to read too spiritually into the text here, but what's a lesson for that for us? I think for me, there's so many times and so many things in our society that we just speak against, we have so much vitriol against, just like Jonah with this Nineveh. But when you actually put a face to it, it's much harder to do that for. You know, it's much harder to, just in our own denomination. I'll use something that I can use within our own camp. We had a lively discussion a few weeks ago in our midrash, me and Michael, that turned out well. And I was insistent, that we can't just say that every pastor out there is preaching lies that they know are not true, just because they're preaching something different than us. And I said, I used to say something along those same lines until I became friends with a couple dozen pastors in town who know where I stand and I know where they stand, and not one of us would look at the other and say, why do you choose to teach lies purposefully? Nobody's doing that. It's this concept of like, it's hard to hate the person you see. And so here at the end, there's like 120,000 faces that are put on this city. Up until this point, it's really just referred to as a city, but here's 120,000 faces.
Not to mention they're not any smarter than the plant.
Not any smarter than the plant. Well, okay, what does that mean to not know your left from your right? What does that mean to you? What do you think that means? Definitely not smart. So there, huh? Lost? Okay. What do you mean by lost? In all sorts of ways?
Well, they didn't even know what deity was attacking them or whatever. They were just like, okay, let's do what we
They didn't know what deity was doing. They just throwing out some stuff, seeing if it'll stick on the wall.
Let's hope that this works.
Uh-huh. Go ahead.
Says they're living in spiritual darkness.
Spiritual darkness. I think that's my... So traditionally, I've looked at this as being like, well, they're like kids. They don't know nothing. Like they're ignorant, they're dumb. I even read some good commentaries of people that I trust that kind of went down that path. Well, they're just not smart people. They're like children in the midst of Jonah. But really, I think I would say that Nineveh is morally ignorant. Would that be what you would think would equate to spiritual darkness? And here's what I mean. There's a couple of times, there's only twice where this verb here doesn't know the left from the right. That's this comparison. It's only used two other times, Deuteronomy 1:39 and 2 Samuel 19:35. And there, it's just comparing two different things. But, and that's kind of where I went. I was like, well, let me look at this verb. It just means to compare. Deuteronomy 1:39 says, the sons who know good from evil will inherit the land. Or who don't know good from evil will inherit the land. And then later on in 2 Samuel, it talks about not being able to discern what is pleasant, what is not. That doesn't really give an indication, but if we take left and right, and we try to say, what does left and right mean as opposed to not knowing left and right? What does that mean biblically to know left and right? I'll tell you my thinking process of where I go when I meditate on these things. The first thing I thought of was Balaam. What am I thinking of with Balaam? The donkey? Okay, what about the donkey? Balaam's traveling along. What's the story of Balaam? Balaam is a prophet. Balaam is a prophet who wants to do what? Make some money at the expense of Israel. And God says, you're not going to do that. I'm not going to allow you to do that. He asked him again. He asked him 3 times. It's almost the opposite. He's speaking to God 3 times words he shouldn't be speaking. Jonah here refuses to speak to God 3 times and then finally does. And God says, okay, whatever, go about your way. And he goes on this donkey path. What happens on the path? Anybody remember?
Donkey.
Angels
Go,
came and brought up.
because it sees the angel.
Wow, but what happened before the donkey sees the angel? What happened?
Go to the lake.
Oh, what happened when he went to the left?
You run him up against the wall.
Okay, and then where'd he go?
Down to his knees, that's you got to be.
He went to the right. Ran him into the wall again. And he breaks his leg, right? And so here's this picture that I started with was of Balaam. I thought of Balaam, and I remember me studying Balaam years ago, and really there's a message there that God is going to set you on a path, and if you're on God's path, there's boundaries. But then I went and did a word study. So Deuteronomy 5, 17, 20, 28, Joshua 1, 23, 2 Chronicles 34, Proverbs 4. All these verses, these chapters have verses that talk about, pull up, let me see, I'll just pull up one, Deuteronomy 5:32. Deuteronomy 5. I didn't put them in there, I just put references to say where this left and right. Is that 5:32? No, yeah. Let's try, I don't have a 5, oh, I'm in Numbers, no wonder. I'm like, I don't have a 5:32. It's because I'm in Numbers. It says, be careful to do as the Lord your God has commanded you. You're not to turn aside to the right or the left. And that's really the gist of all those verses. There's about a dozen of them throughout the Old Testament where God defines what it means to follow him as not going and veering from the right or the left. So what does it mean if you don't know your right from your left? That there's a narrow path, yeah. But what does it mean if you don't know the left or right? Like it's talking about with Nineveh. Spiritual darkness. They don't have a clue what is expected of Yahweh. They don't have a clue what it means to follow him. And so this left and right language, that's where it's coming from. It says that God says, may I not care about the great city? May I not have compassion on this great city of Nineveh? Same word used in the previous verse. We have a couple options. They can both mean compassion or pity. They can both mean troubled or sorry for or not wanting to lose it, or they could mean one or the other. I think how we view this last verse would dictate what it means by God having compassion. Is he not moved by Nineveh? That would be the question. Is he not affected by Nineveh? That's what really Jonah in verse 10, he was affected by the plan. He didn't have concern or compassion for a plant. He was affected by how the plan affected him. And so how do we understand, let's talk about interpreting this last verse, because this gives us all of everything we know about this whole book. How do we interpret this last verse? What kind of sentence is it? Like basic level. In all your Bibles, it should be what's at the end? It's a question mark, yeah. All right, so we think it's a question. What kind of question is it? And I'll, to speed us along because we're running up on time here, we have a couple options. It could be a rhetorical question or an interrogative question. So a rhetorical question, what kind of answer does it expect? No answer. A rhetorical question is really trying to make a statement, sometimes out of sarcasm or satire, which would fit kind of with this book. What's an interrogative question? What kind of answer is it looking for? An intentional answer. It's asking you to answer the question. So which one of those, we'll talk about that for just a minute, which one of those do we think this question is?
The latter.
The latter? It's begging for an answer? All right, why do you think that?
To make those that read it ponder and think about it.
So it's asking for the reader to answer the question. Because what does Jonah do? He don't answer the question. Jonah doesn't really answer questions, all right? He answered the question one time by saying, darn right I want to die. Darn right I'm mad. I want to die. So that's good. I like that. So it could be that it's asking for the audience to ponder what the answer is and come up with the answer. Jonah fails to answer this, but basically, will Tommy fail? Are you going to fail in answering that question? That's good. Anybody think it's rhetorical? That God's making a point?
I thought it was rhetorical, mostly for the same answer he gave.
Oh, you thought it was rhetorical for the same answer? That he was rhetorically asking Jonah, but really wants the reader to ponder. Okay. Just ponder. Oh, just to ponder it.
But are there ever true answers to rhetorical questions?
Are there ever true answers? Well, depending on how it's asked, there usually is, because usually in a rhetorical question, the answer is usually obvious, or should be obvious to the person who's hearing it, right? So it should be, the rhetorical question should answer here, if it's rhetorical and there's no answer intended. It could mean, can Yahweh not show compassion to something that he's not invested in? So just like Jonah, remember this is connected to verse 10. Jonah had no investment in the plant. God has no investment in Nineveh. He's not called them up. He's not raised them up. He's not delivered them from Egypt. So what would be the answer? Can Yahweh not show compassion to something he's not invested in? The answer would be yeah, I guess. What are some other answers to the question that you would have?
I am wondering why is he sorry for such a great city? I mean, the spiritual darkness, Sodom and Gomorrah, they were all in spiritual darkness and he wiped them out. So
That's right.
why is he sorry for them?
We're gonna get there in just a minute, but I think that's hinging on how we interpret that question for compassion, or that word for compassion or pity. Is he really having compassion? Is he really sorry for them? Or is he saying, am I not moved by a city? Am I not moved in the same way that you were about the plant? That's the question. I have a couple other things, but I'm going to get to your point in just a second. There's a lot of people that have been disturbed by there not being an answer to the question. Anybody ever been disturbed by the lack of an answer at the end of Jonah? You have been? Okay. I appreciate the honesty. Why are you disturbed by the lack of answer? You just want to know what's going to happen. That's really good. That's really honest. And it's like, oh, it's on the edge of I didn't point it out earlier. I mean, there's so many times throughout this whole book where the author, if you're reading it for the first time, you're really on the seat of your pants saying, is Jonah really going to do this? Oh, no, he's not. Oh, is he going to do it this time? No, he didn't, And here, you really want to know the end of the of the story. There's been a couple of times throughout history where people have added endings to the story as like commentaries. Midrash Jonah, which is like a very ancient commentary on Jonah, Jewish commentary, basically has Jonah crying out in response, saying, direct your words according to your mercies. Like Jonah comes to the conclusion that God wants him to, that God's merciful and he can do what he wants. Here's a modern one, this guy, W.B. Crouch. He wrote a book on this, on the book of Jonah. It's a pretty neat book, but he says this was the response that he said that Jonah had. O Yahweh, do you have eyes but to see but cannot see, and ears to hear but can't hear? Nineveh's not repented. They, as I in the belly of the giant fish, am only afraid of dying at your hands. They have manipulated your soft heart, just as I have. I remain unrepentant, and so do they. O great and mighty Elohim, you have thought nothing about destroying countless cities through the ages. Are you in this circumstance really that gullible? That's really the question you have, right? This is W.B. Crouch injecting himself in the mind of Jonah and what Jonah's response would be. So how do we answer that? I think his question at the very least highlights the selfishness and the absurdity of Jonah. How can I not do what I want to do if I'm God of the universe, and you can do the very same thing to this plant? If he refuses to care about the morally ignorant people, he should at least care about the animals, right? The animals are mentioned here again in a very comic way. Here's 120,000 people. Oh, and don't forget the animals. But what if I told you that this last sentence, that in every English translation as a question, lacks any indication of any interrogative markers in Hebrew? There's no question marks in Hebrew, right? But we have markers in Hebrew that tell us if something's a question. None of those are in this sentence. So if this is not a question, how would we read it? And what would that statement say? How would we change this question into a statement? Basically, so may would not be in there. So then what would it say?
And you, Jonah, think that I should not pity Nineveh, that great city in which there were more than 120 persons who do not know their right hand from their left, and also much.
So God is still, like, the first person is still in the sentence, but the question is not there. So if we take out may, it's still God as the subject of the sentence. So here's what I came up with, and tell me if this just impacts how you view the end of this book. But I will not have compassion on Nineveh, that important city, which has more than 120,000 people who do not know how to follow my rules, or even its numerous animals. Its numerous animals. That's the animals that are attached to the end. So the question, so may I not have compassion on, there's no interrogative markers in this sentence. The sentence read just as it appears in Hebrew is more along the lines of, but I will not have compassion on Nineveh. Does that help you out in your question? Now, what does that mean for the message of Jonah then? When God says, but I will not have compassion on Nineveh. He said he would, but then he says, I won't.
He's relented before, he could relent again.
He's relented before he could relent again. We know that this is, when we think about our how to study the Bible and how to approach books, one of the main things is trying to place the story in its time. And we talked about how Nineveh at this point, Assyria as a whole, is in shambles. They're in 5 city-states. But what do we say is going to happen in 50 years? 50 years from this story, they're going to rise up, they're going to come, and they're going to take the northern tribes into captivity. And what does God do in return? Vows to specifically destroy Nineveh through the prophet Nahum. And so what's the message? Yahweh will eventually judge Nineveh. He will eventually destroy it. I think Yahweh's mercies for Nineveh is current in this story, but it's limited, right? just because he has mercy on them right now in this one moment. Jonah, you didn't want to follow me. You didn't want to do anything I said. You came all this way to utter 5 Hebrew words, remember? Yeah, I'll give them some mercy right now. But in the end, I'm still going to judge them. But what does that say about the audience? So who's the audience of this book?
Those in exile?
Well, before exile, really. Jonah, if my understanding of when it was written is those before exile. It's written to them before exile. So what's the message to them? Israelites is who I was looking for, but Israel before exile. So if they're reading this, what's their end thought here? Yahweh's mercies are limited to Nineveh, but they're not limited to Israel, right? And what's the question to that city? What's the question to that nation from the message of this book? If Jonah's the first prophet before all the classical prophets, Jonah comes before Amos, before Hosea, he comes before Isaiah, Jeremiah, all the prophets, Ezekiel. If you will just respond to my word, look what I did for Nineveh. Would I not do so much more for the people who truly are mine, for the people who I truly am invested in? That's the message for me. That's the message. What do you think Jonah's thinking? If that's the statement he hears, not a question but a statement where God says, I'm not going to have compassion on Nineveh. What's Jonah's thought process? No, I think that's part of it. But me and how this book has been written thus far, I think Jonah's sitting there thinking, you brought me all the way out here so that I could prophesy to a city that could have killed me. That I could get so mad because I knew theologically that you should destroy them if you say that you will, and then you won't, and now you're telling me you will eventually. I think his theology is affirmed, but it's also qualified at the same time. God says, I will do what I say, but my timing is not your timing. Because Jonah's response, what was he angry about? He was angry that God was doing what God wanted to do at the time that Jonah didn't want him to do it. He asked Yahweh to be Yahweh when Yahweh said, I'm not going to do that right now. Well, I think, yeah, in the end, if that's his statement, if his statement is, I'm going to eventually destroy Nineveh, you just ran from God. You just stated 4 times in this journey that you just want to die instead of obey God. And in the end, God really is going to do what you had hoped he would do. He would feel a little silly. And I think, like, for me, how many times have I done that, you know? But in the context of the story and in the context of Israelites' history, if Jonah is the first of all the prophets, this is what kicks off what we call classical prophecy, then these words are both words of hope. We see what the shift from a question at the end to a statement. And this is where we kind of see in all other books of prophecy, it's always judgment followed by hope. And here, if it shifts from a question to a statement, you see that very thing. If you'll just respond to me, will you respond to me? If I send my prophets to you like I sent this measly little degenerate prophet to Nineveh, will you listen to them? Will you put on sackcloth and ashes? Will you turn from your wicked ways? And if you do, I will relent. But what's Israel do? They refuse to listen to the prophets. They kill some of them. They shed their blood in the temple court. And what does God do? He doesn't relent. If they would have just heard the message of Jonah and let that be the first warning for everything that would come afterwards, they would know. And then, when they don't obey and Nineveh takes them into captivity, they should know, they should remember that God would eventually destroy them. Any last thoughts?
We actually had a couple prophecies on some of the, like I think Ezekiel said he wanted to go in and cry against or whatever. I can't remember. Basically, it's like they're not going to listen to him.
Oh, yeah, there's many prophets who said they won't listen.
They're not going to listen to you, but
Yeah. Basically, like, why am I going to speak to them? They're not going to listen anyway. Jeremiah says it over and over. If you would Jeremiah's written, they're all written after they actually give their verbal prophecies, and so when they write them, you kind of see that, because the prophets have spoken, and then they write down at some point later on. So you see that kind of injected into the text, where it's like, here's the prophecies I gave, they didn't listen, so you kind of see that woven in almost all the prophecies, and so
I like that, spread the rest of the gospel. It's all about
nobody will listen. Yep. Nobody will listen. Any other thoughts? Any other ideas on what you think the message is, the overall message is? You've gone through 4 chapters across like 6 weeks.
Obvious some weeks, but in my mind, it kept going back to the king, giving the instruction that, and put on the sackcloth and told them to fast.
Mm-hmm.
Even the animals.
Yeah, the king put it on first and then told them to put it on. So what does that mean to Israel? That's almost a warning to their kings. And at Jonah's time, the king was high on the hog. He was trying to expand his borders and do all this stuff. They don't need God. They're doing it all on their own. And so I think there's a message to the kings there.
But he didn't have the right intention.
Talking about the king? Well, so he knew what to do, but he really was throwing stuff at the wall, right? Because in the end, God doesn't respond to the sackcloth, to the ashes, to the lament, the mourning. He responds when they stop doing their evil ways. And that's what Israel should learn and should know from this. If you'll just stop doing the evil deeds. Has this helped anybody view Jonah in a different light? A good bit? A little bit? The overall message is, well, I don't know. I think there's a big shift, but I think a lot of y'all, when we talked about the overall message, y'all didn't really have necessarily strong preconceived notions. We kind of talked about some popular notions of it. I think if you're talking about the overall traditional views of Jonah, this kind of goes in the face of it, but I think it's more in the details of the stuff in Jonah. We've seen word uses. We define words. We've talked about poetic uses of words throughout. We've talked about the historical context where Jonah finds the story placed into history and how all those factors come into play as we understand the story itself. What else? Any other things? Any other statements, comments, questions? I thought y'all'd have so many more comments about the whole book at this point.
I think it was interesting, one of the last things he said was how Jonah was the first.
Jonah was the first of many Now, there's some scholars that would disagree. Some scholars would say Jonah was written way later. But there's also a good bit of scholars who say, like kind of what I say. I didn't come up with that on my own. I'm reading and learning from other people. So John Walton is one of the main ones. John Walton's a pretty prestigious scholar. A scholar by the name of Hoyt, last name Hoyt, is female. And then some others, Simmons. They all kind of take the stance that this is really the earliest prophecy to Israel. So anything else at all? Terrible prophet Jonah was? Yeah. It was. So how many times did Jonah speak in the whole thing? A prophet's job is to be the mouthpiece of God. So how many words did he speak in 4 chapters? He spoke 5 words to the Ninevites. And I didn't count how many words he spoke when God asked him, "Are you angry?" at the plant. But it couldn't have been much more than 5 in Hebrew. It was few. It was about 10. About 10 words in 4 chapters. This prophet, the one who's supposed to be the mouthpiece of God,
Did he tell the sailors to throw him overboard?
told his sailors to throw him overboard. There's so much in there, and so much even like here, him sitting on a hill, worried about the wind and the scorching sun, when really he could go. And what I think the text is saying, as it shifts to Elohim at the end of the book. You're basically an Ninevite anyway. Why don't you go sit in the city with them and find shelter? There's a lot of comedy, a lot of good stuff. I thought it would be a good thing here. So we'll talk about where to move next. I kind of am interested in what y'all want to say, but we can stop the stream and talk about that afterwards, and we'll get a game plan moving forward. But if there's no other questions, I'm just excited that y'all learned something more about Jonah than you knew before. the bigger question, because this was really a culminating exercise of how to study the Bible, has it helped you understand how to approach the Bible and books of the Bible better, as far as all of the different things we talked about 2-3 months ago, and historical context, language, genres, literary genres, when it was written versus when it happened, all those things? I hope so. All right, we'll go to prayer. Father, we thank you for this evening. We thank you for the ability to study your word, the freedoms that we have to come together without any threat on our life, to be able to worship you and to understand your character better. I pray that your word will be a lamp unto our feet and a light unto our path as we go forward for the rest of the week, that we would interact with those in our city and those around us in a way that would compel them to want to know you better and want to know you more. And if they don't know you, that our lives would be a witness of the sacrifice that was given up for us through Jesus, our Messiah. We love you. We bless you.